What's up everybody, it's Joe here with Joseph Blake Photography, and I am here out in the Spring Mountain Wilderness west of Las Vegas to give you my long-term review of the Canon 14-35 f4L IS RF lens. Now my long-term review will focus mainly on the areas of use that I have had with this lens since I have purchased it. I did buy this lens with my own money. This video is not sponsored, although there are links below to my gear list, which includes this lens. Those are affiliate links. They do help out the channel when you purchase using those. And the areas that I have been concentrated mostly on with this lens have been outdoor photography, landscapes, adventures, and some areas where I needed a small, lightweight kit. We'll talk more about that as we get into the review. But in case you're curious, I'll throw some specs up here on the screen. This is a 14-35 millimeter full frame RF Canon lens for the RF mount. It is image stabilized. It is an f4 aperture with 9 aperture blades that are rounded. It has a 77 millimeter filter mount that will accept regular filters, no additional glass coming off the front. It does have a focus ring and a control ring, as well as its zoom ring, and the zoom does protrude just a little bit from the body. It does provide 5.5 stops of image stabilization within the lens, and it does have an autofocus and an IS button on the side. It is fully weather sealed, plastic and metal construction, and it weighs just over 500 grams. So those are the generic details that you can read on the website. Honestly, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. As someone who's been walking around with this camera, riding with this camera for quite some time now, let me tell you about 3 specific areas that I think are the most important for this particular lens. Number 1 is build quality and ergonomics. So when you first take this lens out of the box and out of the container and you pull away the plastic and the foam and you hold this thing in your hand, the first thing you think, I'll be real honest, is this feels almost like a toy. And at first that feels almost like a negative. It feels like it would be on the con side of this lens. It is extremely lightweight at 560 grams, I think. It feels somewhat plasticky on the outside, although more and more of the Canon lenses feel that way. Unlike, say, the 17-40 or any other Canon lens, especially from the EF line, that had more of a metallic feel to them. This one definitely feels like it's made out of composite materials, almost carbon fiber. It's very light plastic, but the interior is strong and rigid. But first things first, you pull it out of the box and you're like, oh, this feels almost like a kit lens. And then you put it on your camera and it feels perfect. So when you're attaching the lens to an RF mount camera, I'm on the R6 Mark II right now, that feels great. So even though initially it feels a little, I don't know if I would say cheap, but it definitely has a lighter quality to it. But when you attach it to the camera, you feel that that cinch, that snap, and there's no question that not only is it on there, but this lens is of high quality. Then when you manipulate the zoom ring, it feels smooth, it feels fluid, and as the element moves slightly in and out from the front of the lens, it does have just a slight amount of that. Honestly, it feels fantastic. It doesn't have that kind of clangy feel that you get from a cheaper plasticky kit lens. It feels smooth, it feels solid, and it feels dampered. Speaking of the rings on this camera, it comes with 3. It has the zoom ring, it has a focus ring, and it has a control ring. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't use those. I will, in some rare instances, use the focus ring if I am doing landscapes where I want to make sure that my long distance stuff is just crisp. But I find that that's less and less a necessity here with this lens, with the new AF system, with Canon. They just seem to lock on every time and it seems fine. I don't find myself doing a lot of manual focus adjusting. And as for the control ring, I know there's lots of cool ways to use that. I don't use it. Maybe I will in the future. Tell me down in the comments why you use the control ring, what you use it for on a Canon camera. I think it's a great idea. I just don't have an idea how to use it. All right, and moving further towards the front of the lens has a 77mm mount. Now, I've had 2 other wide angle lenses like this. One is, as I mentioned before, the 17-40 f4L. That lens has been around for a very long time. I think it came out in the film era. So it's an EF lens, but designed for like EF film cameras. It is autofocus, and it had a 77mm mount. And I use a lot of lenses with 77mm, and I use a lot of ND filters and polarizing filters, both in video and when I'm shooting stills. But the 17-40, while it would accept standard filters, it only went to 17, and it suffered from a lot of image performance issues. And it just wasn't wide enough for some of the stuff that I wanted to do. So I actually went out and bought a 14mm prime from Samyang. I wish I still had that lens to show it to you and review it, but I've sold it since I bought this lens. And that was a 14mm f2.8 prime manual focus. And for me, that was a mistake of a purchase for a couple of reasons. One, it was wide, but had even more performance issues from an optical performance standpoint. And it had a super bulbous front mount, front lens element that made it impossible to put filters on it unless you used big square filters that you attach to the front of your lens. And that just wasn't something that was compatible with the types of photography that I was doing with that kind of wide focal length. So now fast forward to this lens, the 14-35. Not only does it have the 77mm mount, not only does it not really move all that much when you zoom, but the element is practically flat. Meaning you can put anything on the front of it, you don't have to worry about it, and there's very little distance between the front element of your lens and your filters. And for me, that's very important because I don't think there is one shot, whether it's video or stills, that I am doing or thinking about doing where a polarizer or an ND filter is not at least a part of the equation or potentially part of the thinking for that shot. And I don't want to limit myself. So the build quality is phenomenal. The exterior controls and kind of fit and finish, as well as the functionality of the filter ring and the buttons and all that sort of thing, is amazing. But let me tell you my favorite part of this lens. The thing that I mentioned in the beginning that I thought actually would be a problem is that this thing is featherweight compared to every other lens that I have. So it is not only 500-ish grams, but it has image stabilization. So while it's not an f2.8 lens, you get image stabilization at the 500 to 600 gram mark. That weight, for me, when I'm doing the types of things that I would do with a lens like this, adventuring, mountain biking, hiking, going long distances where I'm going to need to carry a lot of my gear, the lower the weight, whether it's in my hand or in a backpack, the better my day. But as light as it is, it performs as well, if not better, than lenses that I've worked with before that are significantly heavier. And that can make a huge difference when you're lugging around a big pack that includes your clothes, your water, your camping supplies, your camera gear, maybe you've got a drone, maybe something else, right? Action cams, batteries, first aid kit. Weight makes a big deal. And when you're lugging around just a ton of stuff, Weight makes a huge difference. And this thing definitely earns its weight in my pack. But it wouldn't matter how light it is if the images are terrible. I mean, that's the whole point, right? We're not out here taking photos and video for the sake of having a light lens. The whole point is that the quality should be good. So let's go down the list of things that you're normally looking at in a lens when you're talking about optical performance. So number one normally is just resolution, right? How sharp is it? And I know those two things aren't exactly the same. But right now I'm shooting on a 24 megapixel EOS R6 Mark II. I've shot on the 20 megapixel R6 Mark I. I've shot on the R5. I've shot on the R3. There's not a resolution available from a Canon camera that is too much for this lens. I shot on the R, it's 30 megapixels, but it resolves more like 24 when you compare it to the R6 Mark II. The 45 megapixels out of the R5, pixel peeping on this lens is actually fun. It is just sharp as a tack. If Canon comes out with a higher megapixel censored camera, like everyone was hoping that they would this year and haven't, it would do just fine up to 60 megapixels, I think. If Canon ever chooses to give us something that cool. So resolution and sharpness is there. On a wide angle lens, when it comes to sharpness, one of the things that you're looking at is sharp in the center and sharpness at the edges. And while there is a slight amount of softness at the extreme edges of this lens, honestly, I still think that it outperforms, even towards the edges, other wide angles that I've used, and honestly, other standard zooms. And while you can correct some of that in post, in Lightroom, sometimes even in the camera with the profile, and on this lens, I see none of that. I have not seen any chromatic aberration. The corners are tack sharp. And as far as flaring is concerned, I shoot into the sun all the time. I shoot sunsets, I shoot sunrises, I shoot portraits into the sun. I love shooting with somebody with the sun behind them. It looks phenomenal. There's no flaring on this lens, almost zero. For this video, I was testing out this lens for flaring. I wanted to get an example shot, and I said, oh, there's a flare. What? I'm gonna tell everybody this thing doesn't flare, and then there's a flare. And I realized it was because I had my ND filter on still, and that caused the flare. I pulled it off, the flare went away. I'm shooting with the sun literally right above me here. This is extreme. There's very little, if any, flaring or optical distortion as a result of that. And while this camera does not vignette significantly, I will say that with the profile turned off, which you should not do in this camera on this lens, but with the profile to correct lens issues turned off, there is a significant amount of corner light loss. It almost looks like the frame is, or the sensor itself is catching the edges of that lens. Now, since this lens came out, they've released profile corrections that effectively fix that. I've turned pretty much all the corrections on and off, and while you do still see vignetting in the corners, that almost just circular vignette that you saw at the very beginning of this lens's release cycle has been corrected through software. And when that happens, I don't see a lot of squeezing or squishing or distortion in that. The camera's not doing a lot to alter the image. It still looks great. But that is one thing to note, that if you are going to be shooting super wide and you want your corners and you're intending to bring up that later on in post, know that you're gonna get some noise. There's gonna be some shadow detail lost as a result of those really, really dark corners. But for a 14mm lens, honestly, I think it's worth it. And when I talk about these things, you know, I'm talking about the whole zoom range. I do not see significant differences in sharpness, contrast, or in color reproduction at any of the zoom range between 14 and 35. Obviously, the corners get a little bit squishier at 14, but honestly, even there, it's still well worth it for the advantage of that wider angle. Additionally, this thing is sharp at f4. It's not the sharpest, but I would say anything beyond f8, you're not really gonna see an appreciable amount of increase, and really even at 7.1, I'm noticing that there's no difference. So if I need the light at 7.1, I'm gonna do it, even though I might think to myself, well, I'd be sharper at f11, 7.1, 8, no problem on the sharpness. Low light performance is phenomenal, although I would say that in addition to the slightly darker corners, the fact that it is a slower zoom, it's an f4, it's not an f2, it's not an f2.8, it's not a prime, right? It's not a 1.8, it's not a 1.4, it's not a 1.2. But that's why you get this lens, right? The 15 to 35, right? The 2.8 that is RF is significantly heavier. I'll put the weight here on the screen. Again, you are adventuring if you are having to pack in your gear and you are having to go long distances where weight is a problem and where water and food, gear, and comfort are all factors in your weight. That is a significant thing to think about. And having IS with the f4 aperture, I have not really run into issues where I have had problems with low light on the R6 Mark II. Honestly, when I find myself wanting to shoot in those really, really low light environments, I'm pulling out my 35 f1.4 or my 51.8 or my 85 1.4. And at the same time, when I really want extreme background isolation that the f4 aperture is not going to provide me, that's where I'd have my 24 to 70 or my 85 1.4 or my 70 to 200. But just to recap, throughout the zoom range, throughout the aperture range, I have not found a still or video situation where this camera does not perform superbly. Not a secret downhill. Not at all a secret downhill. I wonder if I can even climb this. Okay, so then the last thing that I look at when I'm looking at a lens, or really any kind of piece of equipment, is versatility and value. Is it worth it? On the value front, let me tell you this. It's not a cheap lens. That 17 to 40 that I was talking about, I think I spent, I don't know, maybe $600 or $700 on that in 2010. That was my first L lens. That Samyang was probably $300 or $400. And this one isn't cheap. It's 1,500 bucks, or thereabout, depending on where the deals and the sales and whatnot are. And it's been out for a little while. That's a lot for this type of lens in comparison to other lenses from other brands that do similar things. But it's not completely out of the realm of pricing for a super ultra wide zoom lens in the Canon ecosystem. We don't have any option other than Canon. And it is an f4, it's not an f2.8, right? It's in the f4 category of lenses for the L system. It's not in the f2.8. Those are normally the higher end. It's not a variable aperture, it's fixed aperture at f4, right? It's not a 3.5 to 6.3. It is an L lens. So when you take that price and then you think about it from a versatility standpoint, what can it do? Some corporate photography, some product photography, you're doing portraits, maybe you're doing weddings on the weekend. Maybe you're just a content creator, doing video of other types. Maybe you're doing video about mountain biking and you're not actually like a stills photographer or videographer doing your work for clients. What I can tell you is that within the segment that I am comparing this lens to, the area where I think this lens really shines and what I got it for is the outdoor adventuring travel type of work, landscape type of work, nature type of stuff. This zoom range, the 14 to 35, is perfect. You can get those huge epic vistas and sunsets at 14 if you need to, or at 14 you can just get some really interesting shots and looks. It adds a lot of versatility and a lot of kind of variation to your shot list. And you've also got my two favorite focal lengths in there, which is 24 and 35. Kind of intimate, smaller, more interesting landscape scenes and nature scenes at 24 and at 35. And then at 35, you're talking about walking around lens, you're talking about travel. You can do portraits at 35, especially if your style like mine in some cases, is a kind of photojournalist editorial style, which is what I really, really like to shoot when I'm doing things like weddings and portraits and families and events, is I really enjoy that type of look. So you can shoot portraits on this, you can shoot corporate on this, you can shoot all the stuff that I've talked about, all the outdoor adventure stuff and nature, but you can also shoot a lot more. So where does this lens not do well, right? That's all the positive stuff. You know, where are its cons in the versatility conversation? Well, honestly, it is f4. So if you're looking for a lot of compressed backgrounds, a lot of out of focus elements to really get that particular look that people are looking for, especially in portraits, families, weddings, stuff like that, this lens is not for you, because at f4 you're not going to get a lot of that, and you don't have the zoom range to compress the background. You can pull off f4 with a zoom that goes to 70 or 200 or even further and compress the background and get really good out of focus elements. You're not going to get that with this. That's just not what this lens is for. And with that, super low light situations are not great for this lens. And with that focal range, you're also going to just get different kind of facial features as you zoom in and out of that range. You don't want to do portraits at 16 or 20 or something, unless that's the look you're going for, right? If you're doing a skate video, that's what you want. If you're doing portraits, I would be picking up my 85, my 70-200. Those are the two lenses that I use predominantly when I'm doing portrait work, when I'm doing weddings, that, and sometimes my 24-70. So those are and those are 2.8s, and my 85 is a 1.4. Those are my portrait and event lenses. That's not what this lens is for. That's not really where this lens shines. But if you are doing outdoor photography, landscapes, travel photography, product photography, being able to shoot lightweight where f4 isn't an issue, where you need the zoom range up to 35, I'm shooting at right now and I think it looks phenomenal on this lens, then this is the lens for you, even at that cost. Because remember, with that cost you get image stabilization, you're also getting the 77mm filter mount, which means it'll take all the filters that you have for all of your other lenses, and paired with the dual pixel autofocus 2 on any of the more modern Canon cameras, the focus is like instant and it tracks everything. So that's really not even an issue. So that's it, really. I mean, if you think about this lens, and I've had it now for over a year, and the thing that I can tell you without a doubt is that it's never disappointed me. I'm always bringing extra gear and lenses and all these other things with me in my pack, weighing it down, and then I realized that the only lens I needed was this one, especially when I'm out on these adventuring trips. And so being able to just carry the one camera with the one lens is a game changer for me when that lens is as good as this one is. I wouldn't exchange the aperture for the weight, and I wouldn't want an extra 5 or 10 or 15 millimeters of zoom range for the weight, or the cost, or the loss of IS potentially, or the quality of the optics. The versatility is there. It does everything I need. And if 35 just isn't enough for you, honestly, I think a little bit of cropping versus carrying another lens is worth it. And in video mode, digital zoom isn't the worst in the world, especially on the R6, where we go from oversampled 6K to the actual 4K zone on the sensor. It's a little softer, but it's not that bad. But for the price, for the weight, and for the quality of the images that it creates, this lens is the only lens that I need in almost every instance. Now, of course, that depends on the kind of photography that you're doing, but if I'm out here and I've got to take one lens, it's this one. It's the 14-35 f4L RF from Canon. It's my new favorite lens. Although my 85 1.4, although I wouldn't bring that out here because that thing weighs like 8 pounds or something. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you. And if this is something that you're interested in, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. If you're interested in this lens, I've got a link down below. That is an affiliate link. I do make a couple bucks if you click on that link. I appreciate it. It helps support the channel. And if you made it this far in the video, find me on all the places. Find me on Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and my website. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.